All right, well, I think we can go ahead and start now. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Deborah James, and I facilitate the Our World Is Not for Sale, which is a global network of hundreds of public interest groups, development advocates, farmer and fisherfolk networks, environmental organizations, trade unions, and other civil society from the global north and south, working together for a democratic and sustainable multilateral trading system. And we're so glad you could join us here today for a press briefing on food security, fisherfolk livelihoods, taxing big tech, and multilateralism itself hanging in the balance at the WTO Ministerial. And we have a great panel of civil society experts from all corners of the earth who will share their expertise with you today. Our World Is Not for Sale will be bringing a delegation of about 50 people from various civil society organizations around the world, from Argentina, Australia, Bangladesh, Belgium, Bolivia, Germany, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Kenya, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, the Philippines, Spain, Switzerland, Tanzania, Uganda, the United States, and Zimbabwe to MC13 this week. So we know from February 26th to 29th, the United Arab Emirates will host the 13th Ministerial Conference of the WTO. And what is at stake is really a struggle between two visions of what role the WTO, as the world's most powerful economic rulemaking body in the global economy, should play. Should the organization expand as an even more corporate influence body, with rich countries allowed to set agendas, impose negotiations mechanisms in their favor, and leave poorer countries and multilateralism itself in the dustbin of history? Or should the organization, the institution, recognize the constraints that the current rules have placed on developing economies and the harm caused to workers, farmers, and the environment worldwide, not of trade per se, but of the particular set of rules enforced by the WTO? And thus, should it increase the flexibilities from those onerous rules for developing countries to be able to use trade for their development? As we know, the original WTO rules were written about 30 years ago at the insistence of big corporate interests, big agriculture, big industry, big finance. Developing countries realized that they got a terrible deal, and they had problems implementing those rules because they were constraining their development, which is what the rules were actually intended to do. Developing countries, as we know, put forth over 100 proposals for flexibilities that got morphed into the development agenda as part of the Doha round of WTO expansion. And in all those years, developed countries have never agreed to any of those developing country demands. Nevertheless, developed countries have consistently come up with new ways to expand the disciplines that the WTO places on governments' ability to shape their economies in the interests of their populations. And now we see there's been paralysis in the dispute settlement system because of the United States. But rich countries are still seeking, while blocking the development agenda, to create new mechanisms to ensure that the global South countries remain primary producers of raw materials and labor and open markets, while rich countries engage in the most extreme form of protectionism possible, which is the maximalist intellectual property protections, which are intended to foster monopoly, diminish choice in the market, and raise prices, distorting trade hundreds and thousands of degrees more than a few percentage points of tariffs, or a few tens of dollars, or even maybe a couple $100 to a poor farmer or fisher person. And as we know, even during the global pandemic, rich country members were vehemently opposed to flexibilizing these onerous intellectual property rules, no matter how many hundreds of thousands or millions of people died as a result. The WTO has blood on its hands from the pandemic, but that's not the only issue. The Ministerial Declaration itself, which rich countries are trying to use to turn the WTO into an institution that is multilateral when it suits them, but is the opposite of multilateral when it pleases their corporate interest to abrogate and erode multilateralism. And we'll also have a speaker's comments from an expert speaker on the joint statement initiatives, which would be a death knell for the WTO as a multilateral institute as we know it. We'll also have a speaker on the so-called environmental JSIs, or rather the attempt to put old wine in new bottles by using sustainability rhetoric to market more market liberalization. We'll also have a speaker specific to the life or death negotiations on agriculture, as well as another on the issue of fisheries. We'll also have one on the tax holiday for big tech, or in WTO speak, the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. And last but not least, given the leadership of the African group throughout these negotiations in the past year, we'll hear from an expert speaker from an African-specific perspective. So to open today, I'd love to give the floor to Kinda Mohammadieh. She is a senior researcher and legal advisor with the Third World Network. Kinda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Deborah, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join this press conference today. So I will be speaking on the importance of delivering for development at MC13. As we know, the promise to deliver on developmental outcomes is the long-standing yet undelivered promise. And MC13 today is promoted as a WTO reform ministerial, while we see the speak about development often marginalized. But without delivering for development, the WTO will be leaving the majority of its members from among developing countries and LDCs behind. And the notion of development is core to the objectives of the WTO as expressed in its mother agreement, the Marrakesh Agreement. And this is why the aim of reforming the WTO today cannot be decoupled from the developmental objectives or the promise to deliver for development. WTO reform is sought to enable the institution, which is the custodian of the objective of developing a more integrated, viable, and durable multilateral trading system, to deliver for all its members. And if we don't put development as a core criteria for assessing success at the 13th Ministerial Conference, we will not be heading in the right direction. Because today, the development divide persists between developed and developing countries, although in different characteristics compared to when the WTO was established. What we see today is more intense exposures to vulnerabilities emanating from exogenous factors with deep, long-standing implications on the developmental trajectories in developing countries. This was clearly demonstrated in the latest crises, but also continues to be reflected every day in the constraint imposed by the climate change crises and the global environmental degradation. So this is why we need to look at what history tells us. And it tells us that those developing countries that were able to achieve development gains did it by utilizing strategically national policy space in the context of this changing global economic and political conditions. And this is why a development-friendly WTO or trading system has to combine multilateral discipline and adequate policy space, and it has to deliver within that context. And if we look at the situation today, we can see instead of serving those objectives, we can see an attempt to dilute and redraw the fundamentals of how development is addressed under the WTO rules by diluting special and differential treatment, by attempting to differentiate among developing countries, and by denying that the rules have been designed in an imbalanced way and there are deficiencies that are structurally created that needs to be addressed. So if we want to look at what MC13 can deliver in regards to development, we can speak about three priority issues. One is to deliver on the long-standing mandate on making special and differential treatment more effective and operational, which is something that the group G90, which is the biggest group of members at the WTO, is calling for, and it's a long-standing mandate that has not been delivered on yet. The second issue that we need to see being delivered on is addressing the issues of policy space for sustainable industrialization, economic diversification, and structural transformation. And to do that, the African group and other developing countries have been calling for special flexibilities or adapting the WTO rules to provide flexibilities for developing countries and least developed countries to address the issues pertaining to their catch-up policies in order to achieve their developmental objectives. And this is very important to be addressed under the ministerial outcome document, which we see until today very imbalanced in terms of its content. And the third pillar of delivering for development at the ministerial would be recognizing the need for an inbuilt mechanism to allow developing countries and LDCs to better and more expeditiously respond to crises they face, whether climatic, food, health, financial, with a view to avoiding the deepening and the spreading of such crises in the future. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kinda. And next we will have a recording from Professor Jane Kelsey. She is a professor of law emeritus from the University of Auckland and is an expert since before the WTO was founded on multilateral trade rules. If we can play the recording. It's like 3 in the morning in New Zealand, so. No sound.
Yvonne, you need to unmute yourself and then start from the beginning.
Kia ora and greetings to you all. My name is Jane Kelsey. I'm a retired academic in New Zealand. I've been following the WTO since it was created and its first ministerial conference in Singapore in 1996. I'm going to talk specifically about negotiations and, as we've heard, the Doha Development Round that was launched in 2001 has become paralysed. And a number of countries at the 11th Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires in 2017 decided they would, as a number of breakaway groups, set up their own processes for negotiations, issued a number of statements, and these initiatives became known as the Joint Statement Initiatives, or JSIs. That's despite the fact that the WTO's constitution, the Marrakesh Agreement, says no new negotiations should be launched except by decisions taken by consensus. What we saw instead was the setting up of negotiations around pet topics with no mandate outside the mandated bodies to conduct such work on those topics, and using Secretariat resources that have not been budgeted for that purpose. Several of those, especially the JSI on electronic commerce and the one on domestic regulation of services, have been undertaken despite the fact that there are parallel processes dealing with those issues in the WTO. In the case of another, investment facilitation, it's in the face of decisions by the membership previously not to negotiate on investment until the Doha round was concluded. So let me look at the first of these to be concluded, known as the reference paper on regulation of domestic services. And effectively, that reference paper would impose disciplines or constraints on the way that governments can regulate services behind the border domestically. It was done, as I mentioned, bypassing what is a limited mandate in the General Agreement on Trade and Services to develop such disciplines. and the Working Party on Domestic Regulation. That's the place that should occur. The agreement that it produced, known as a reference paper, effectively amends the rules of the GATS without going through the amendment processes that are required in the WTO Marrakesh Agreement. Basically, it addresses the policies, criteria, procedures, practices governments can use to regulate services, specifically on licensing requirements and procedures, qualification requirements and procedures, and technical standards. The kind of authorization or permission to supply those services and the terms and conditions on which they can do so. That will require a number of developing countries, virtually all developing countries who were to adopt this, to make quite significant institutional reforms. But the developed countries largely have those in place. So a kind of reverse special and differential treatment. Two examples of those rules that show their implications. One is the right of foreign states and corporations to comment on and therefore lobby against proposed new laws and regulations and have those comments considered by the decision makers. Guarantees that aren't even available to domestic citizens. Second is that new measures must be based on so-called objective and transparent criteria, which means that precautionary measures, for example, taken in relation to licensing of mining companies, could not be adopted as being objective and transparent criteria. So countries would have to rely on general exceptions, and in the past, they've almost always lost when they have done so. This has not been proceeded with through the formal amendment processes under the Marrakesh Agreement that would require consensus. Only 40% of WTO members have supported this reference paper, meaning 60% have not. And what we've seen happen is an attempt, therefore, to bypass that consensus requirement and adopt them through the back door of an improper use of country schedules in the Trade and Services Agreement. India and South Africa have challenged that as an abusive process that will create precedents with really serious systemic impacts. It would erode the rules-based nature of the Constitution, the consensus decision-making process, and allow more powerful countries to cherry-pick the topics on which to develop new rules. So a breakdown of multilateralism and a sidelining of the issues of importance to developing countries. That objection is still being sorted through, and India and South Africa are trying to get a revision of the way those schedules are used. The second of the JSIs that's also been concluded is on investment facilitation, sometimes called investment facilitation for development, but there is no development in it. This would impose, again, serious compliance obligations on developing countries that they would find really difficult to comply with, and would not address any of the kinds of concerns that there are as to why investors are not investing in them, which are usually things like infrastructure, scale of the economies, and so on. But the legality of this one is even more problematic because there is this negative decision in the WTO about investment negotiations. Nevertheless, they've proceeded with this, and in July last year, concluded an agreement, but are planning to introduce it, if they can, through the next ministerial meeting as a so-called Annex 4 plurilateral agreement, which would require consensus. And there is no consensus. What we've seen is enormous pressure, especially from China, on developing countries, back in capital on politicians. Some of the stories are hair-raising about the pressure. South Africa and India, again, have led the objections to this and have been totally vilified, including in an absolutely improper speech last week by the Director General of the WTO. The third JSI that's most prominent is on electronic commerce. Again, despite there being a work program in place in the WTO, designed to have a hands-off approach to regulating big tech, including data. Now, governments are belatedly realizing now that there are major problems with this and they need to regulate big tech. That has culminated in the US withdrawing its own proposals on free movements of data in this JSI on e-commerce. The members are currently now trying to push for a JSI light without addressing these issues. Similar problems will arise about how that's to be adopted. So you should get the picture, I hope, that what we're seeing is real power politics and dirty politics, more than I've seen through the 30 years of the WTO's operation. I've never seen anything this overt and divisive at the systemic level. This is, of course, just one of the power plays happening at the MC13, but it should fundamentally dispel any notions that the WTO is anything more than an institution by and for major powers and their commercial and geostrategic interests. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a good webinar.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that excellent summary. Worse power politics than she's ever seen in 30 years. Next, we'll have Abhijit Das. He is an independent WTO expert to speak to us about the environmental JSIs. Go ahead, you have the floor, Abhijit.
Thank you, Deborah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Jane has already mentioned some of the non-multilaterally mandated initiatives, popularly called joint statement initiatives, that are being undertaken primarily at the behest of the developed countries. Of course, many developing countries are also participating in some of these initiatives. In the arena of environment, quite a few of these plurilateral initiatives are around. For example, there's a plurilateral initiative on informal dialogue on plastics. There's another one on fossil fuel subsidy reform, and a third one on trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions. What do these various environmental initiatives, plurilateral initiatives, have in common? Well, it's first and foremost not about protecting the environment. It's more about using environmental concerns as a smokescreen to push pure and simple mercantilistic commercial objectives. To give you one illustration, all of us are familiar with the controversial carbon border adjustment measure of the European Union, which is ostensibly going to be put into place to control carbon leakage. Now, this important environmental measure, which will restrict trade, which will disrupt trade, particularly exports of developing countries, will do very little for addressing the carbon emission problem. A study by UNCTAD clearly shows that after CBAM is fully implemented, it will not reduce global carbon emissions by more than 0.1%. So let's be clear. Trade measures taken with the objective of promoting environment will do very little for the environment, instead will promote the commercial interests of the developed countries. And through these plurilateral initiatives, some of the ways in which this would be done would be, for example, there could be suggestions that options be explored for making agreements at the WTO and the existing multilateral environmental agreements mutually supportive. This, in a nutshell, will give a legal justification to the developed countries to impose restrictions on the ground of environmental concerns. This would make it extremely difficult for developing countries to legally challenge these measures, even if these restrictions do not have a significant positive impact in addressing environmental problems. The second strand of commitments that might emerge from these discussions include eliminating tariffs on environmental goods and services, rather liberalizing environmental services, Of course, in their transition to a low carbon economy, demand for environmental goods and services such as waste management, production and coal and storage of renewable energy in most developing countries is likely to surge. Most developing countries do not as yet have a vibrant domestic industry for manufacturing these products. However, if they are compelled to eliminate tariffs on these products, then they will never ever be able to create a vibrant domestic industry which can produce some of these environment-friendly goods. What will happen? They will become almost overwhelmingly dependent on imports from the developed countries, and that is how the developed countries will get almost unimpeded market access for their goods and for services as well. Along the similar lines, there are certain suggestions to harmonize technical regulations on the basis of environmental performance. Again, this sounds good, but if we dig a bit deeper, this will really result in standards being applied equally to domestic producers as well as to imported products. If the domestic producers are unable to comply with these harmonized standards, which are harmonized at a very high stringent level prevailing, particularly in the developed countries, then they cannot even sell in their own domestic market. There could be also suggestions to provide non-discriminatory treatment of renewable energy equipment. In other words, the flexibility which many developing countries have to bend in favor of the domestic producers when government procures for its own use is sought to be deprived on the grounds of promoting renewable energy equipment. In a nutshell, many of these issues are being discussed in the plurilateral initiative. These are not yet multilateral. What can we expect at MC13? There is likely to be a very strong push by the proponents, mainly the developed countries, to give some sort of a multilateral mandate to mainstream these discussions into the WTO, take it away from the plurilateral initiatives, make it a WTO multilateral initiative. What would be the outcome? As we've seen, the outcome is really going to be robbing developing countries of the policy flexibility to implement catch-up policies for domestic production of green goods, green technologies, green services. Who will benefit at the end of the day? Very clearly, the first movers who are mainly located in the developed world. To conclude, the initiatives which are happening among some WTO members at the sidelines, which are not multilaterally mandated, these initiatives will open the flood doors for promoting the commercial interests of the developed world. It may not do much for promoting the environment, as we've seen in the context of EU's CBAM. So with those few words, let me conclude, and we'd be very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. And we're going to move right to our next speaker. I'm aware of time, and we still have 4 more folks, and we want to give time for questions. So please, Sofia Scacerra, who is a researcher with the Transnational Institute. She's from Argentina. Sofia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Deborah James, and thank you for the audience for being here today to listen to us and the importance of these points of view in the negotiations for the next WTO Ministerial. There is no need to talk about the power of big tech. It goes without saying that in recent years, we have seen great benefits from digitalization, but also great threats to our economies, our democracies, and our cultures as a result of a massive digitalization monopolized by a few technological corporations. In this sense, free competition and the emergence of alternative technologies becomes crucial and relevant to maintain competitive markets, achieve digital industrialization, and sustain the necessary diversity on the internet. The WTO has been renewing the moratorium on customs duties and electronic transmissions almost automatically since 1998. This fact is relevant. While we did not even consider the importance of data in the global economy, Silicon Valley companies had already obtained a tax exemption on the raw materials of their business model, thanks to the lobbying they have done. Over the years, we saw how this moratorium started to show its problems, and more countries started to raise concerns about what it means and what it includes. At the UN, they started to discuss the importance of starting to tax technology companies. But meanwhile, the WTO seems to be going in the opposite direction. The moratorium is a tax exemption to unleash the most outrageous commodity extractivism in history. Such a process can only be compared to the discovery of America and the plundering of Africa for centuries. Technology companies pay no taxes and take raw materials across borders without restrictions. We must be aware of this. This extractivism not only financially benefits large technology companies, but also prevents peripheral countries from having fundamental elements of financing and public policy to be able to generate their own digital industrialization. Peripheral countries have wealth in terms of human resources and the capacity to generate new competitive advantage every day in digital industries. Imagine what a tax that protects digital ecosystems from data extractivism and benefits companies that operate, produce, and store data within borders could do. But not only that, but the world is debating the climate crisis. We all know what data centers pollute. Most of the data that is generated in the economy is not productive, but data that is collected and stored because it can and has a marginal cost close to zero. If we could tax the transfer of data, it will lower the amount of data that is traded internationally and thus reduce the amount of rubbish data circulating in the economy, benefiting the environment. A sort of Tobin tax on data could create incentives for companies to be more responsible about the data they store and where they store it. The world needs resources. Technology companies are far from paying taxes, but on the contrary, it is known and documented how they evade them every day. It is time to change that and leave the door open for governments to collect and for companies to stop this terrible plundering. We must stop renewing the moratorium and be able to leave the door open to a tax policy of countries and regions. Achieving the digital industrialization of peripheral countries, it is not a dream. It is possible and necessary if we want a more competitive and diverse economy in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And without further ado, to keep going, we'll hear next from Adam Wolfenden. He is a campaigner with the Pacific Network on Globalization, also based in the Pacific. He's in Australia, and so we have a short recording from him, if we can get that going, please.
Kia ora and greetings to you all.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and for making the time to hear the statement that I will share on the fisheries subsidies negotiations that will be discussed at the ministerial in next week. So the Pacific Network on Globalization, which is the organization that I work for, and it's a Pacific Islands-based regional NGO that has focused on trade issues for a long time, and in particular, making sure that small island development states get a fair deal on any trade deals that are struck. And so as major resource holders of fish, the fisheries subsidies negotiations are particularly interest to both Pang, but also the colleagues that we work with around the world on this issue. So when we're talking about these subsidies, it's really important to remember where the problem lies. So, there's plenty of data out there, plenty of statistics that show very clearly how large-scale industrial fishing, particularly distant water fishing, takes not only the majority of the harmful subsidies or the problematic subsidies, but also is responsible for most of the overfishing globally. And so when you consider that's quite widely known, it's important to take that lens, and accompany that with the Sustainable Development Goal, which is supposedly the mandate for really driving these current negotiations, and using that as a lens to weigh up just how effective these negotiations are playing out. And so our view is that there's a lot of issues with these current negotiations, the way that they're playing out, and I'll walk you through some of them now. Excuse me. The first of which is that those most responsible for the situation of overfishing globally aren't being held accountable. So we've seen in a lot of other environmental or sustainability-based agreements, there's this principle of common but differentiated responsibility. That's not being applied in these negotiations. And you can see that through the text. The list of prohibitions and then the easily accessible flexibilities that particularly big large-scale fleets, or those countries that have big fleets and have historically overfished the waters, will easily be able to meet those thresholds to effectively continue as they have been. So we're seeing this inability to target the problem, which is resulting in an agreement that not only fails the mandate from the Sustainable Development Goals, but also doesn't address that problem which I was talking about previously. There's no really explicit prohibitions on subsidies that are, for these large-scale fleets. Second of all, we're seeing the small-scale fishers getting caught up in this agreement. Like I said, they're the least responsible for overfishing. They receive the least amount of subsidies. Yet, there's a fight happening over the definition of small-scale fishers within this negotiation. And again, there's a fight happening over a section of the fishing industry that isn't responsible for this problem. And so it's highly problematic. And the result will be that there will be small-scale fishers who will be the collateral damage of this fight between, countries who have quite large communities and populations of small-scale fishers, and those looking to effectively cut off abilities of other developing countries to maintain or even nurture fishing industries. And so for a lot of those developing countries, and this is the next point, is that the flexibilities are really inadequate and problematic. So there's been a big push to carve up how special and differential treatment, which is the term used for these flexibilities for developing countries, are accessed. And so there's a tiered system which really undermines that principle of special and differential treatment, which is an acknowledgement of the capacity constraints that developing countries have, and allows them greater flexibilities. Whereas the fisheries subsidy proposals are really breaking that up and introducing a lot of tiered systems and a lot of thresholds which are inadequate in terms of being an appropriate and effective flexibility as per the Sustainable Development Goal mandate, but also makes it hard for countries to fit into and potentially acts as a dampener on their aspirations for development. Another key point is that with the proposed sustainability flexibility, so this basically says you can provide the prohibited subsidies as long as you can prove to the WTO that your fishing is sustainable or that your stocks are managed in a sustainable way. This raises a number of issues. One is who can really access this flexibility. And like I was saying before, this is a capacity flexibility for those big fleets who can prove this quite easily, who have the ability to manage, measure, and fund their fleets. They will be able to meet this, and notify the WTO. They will be able to easily access this flexibility. But for developing countries, it's a lot harder. Their capacity constraints. We see this all the time in the WTO about failure to make notifications. That's often based on capacity issues. So this is a flexibility that really is either for developed countries or those big fishing nations, if you were developing countries. So you have a flexibility that's essentially a reverse of special difference treatment. It's just for those who have capacity. And I'm conscious of time, so maybe I'll wrap it up here, but it's just worth highlighting again that, you know, when these negotiations play out, what will often be the political narrative is that developing countries are asking for too many flexibilities. And it's important to understand that this is being framed like this because the developed countries have already gotten their carve out. They're already effectively being protected through this sustainability flexibility, and they're wanting to shift the blame for any failure onto developing countries who are often the same countries who are having to, feed and support large, small-scale and artisanal fishing populations, and they have to be responsible to those communities and accountable to those communities too. So we're calling on the WTO to, meet its mandate, target the problem, and do so in a process that's democratic, inclusive, and not reliant on a small number of negotiators being able to negotiate all through the night. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Adam. And without further ado, we'll go to the next multilateral negotiations. We just have 2 more speakers and then we'll open it up for questions. I think you guys can use the Q&A procedure, so that should hopefully work for everyone. Next, we have Ranja Sengupta, who is a senior researcher with the Third World Network in India. He'll speak to us about agriculture and food security. Ranja, you have the floor.
Thank you, Deborah. And let me not waste any time. I mean, I'm from India, and of course, India has a massive interest in the agricultural negotiations. But today I'm going to talk really not about India so much, but all developing countries and kind of the political dynamics that we see in the agriculture negotiations. And let us remember that agriculture was supposed to be the area of interest to developing countries, because they were the ones who had, higher GDP and, lot of their population engaged in the agriculture sector. It was a key food security and livelihood issue for them. And in a way, they were promised that in the WTO, the Western subsidies would be disciplined. They would be getting fairer access to global agricultural markets and so on. And also would be having the tools, they should be able to use agriculture trade for their own development, but we haven't really seen that happening over the history of the WTO. Now coming to MC13, and what we've been seeing, in fact, over the past few ministerials, that there are mandated issues, and I know all of you who are following the agriculture negotiations know the issues quite well, but the key issue, on the table is public stockholding, and a permanent solution is due, and this is about giving farmers in developing countries, governments being able to give them a subsidy through an administered price at which they buy for public food programs. So the objective, and in my country, we have a very large public distribution system. It's called PDS. And the objective is, on the one hand, to support consumers through subsidized food grains, and on the other hand, to support production and livelihoods of farmers through an administered support price. But this subsidy, is considered like it's trade distorting, so it has to be subject to this very tight WTO rules. So since 2013, in fact, the time of the Bali Ministerial, in spite of an interim decision, we know developing countries have been fighting, and they've been it was mandated that they would get a permanent solution. They've been fighting for a permanent solution, which was supposed to come in 2017, but we haven't seen that happening. In this ministerial, and there was a proposal by 80 countries, the G33, the African group, and the ACP countries, 80 countries together, and including many LDCs, submitted a proposal, Job 229, in 2022, before the last ministerial, that actually provided a blueprint for this permanent solution. But we see that it's been repeatedly blocked by many developed countries, also the Keynes group of agriculture exporters, and they've been basically told last ministerial, even this ministerial, that no, sorry, you cannot have it. And so this is one issue, and we know that these countries, the 80 countries, they are still committed to this 229 document, and they are really saying that even for MC13, the the permanent solution has to be given. But we know that the reality of the negotiation is that likely this is stuck and there will not be any outcome. The other issue is, of course, special safeguard mechanism that developing countries wanted to be able to raise import duties when they are faced with an import surge, because that is absolutely catastrophic for farmers and production. It brings in great volatility and uncertainty. Then, of course, the issue of cotton subsidies, domestic support on cotton given by US and other developed countries, which has wreaked havoc, say, on key cotton producing countries in Africa, also other developing countries. So these issues were mandated issues under the QAS, but we see that they are totally stuck, and we kind of, in realistic terms, we are not even expecting an outcome on these anymore. Domestic support, it was, as I said, from the beginning of the WTO, the promise was that Western subsidies would be disciplined under the AOA, but we don't see that happening. But in fact, now new formula are coming in from the Keynes group, which actually imposes disciplines and commitments on everybody. So even development subsidies, even de minimis subsidies that are promised to developing countries are all clubbed together, and everybody is supposed to cut. Whereas developing countries have been saying that, no, there are countries, mainly developed countries, who enjoy extra entitlements, you cut them first. So, but these issues are not moving. For us, it's very, very disappointing and very frustrating. And we work with farmers groups across many countries. They are all actually watching these outcomes. But let me just also end by saying that on the other hand, we see issues such as, constraints, that there should not be any constraints on export restrictions or market access. These kind of issues are being promoted, and there is this, the effort to get very strong mandates. Even last ministerial, we saw in the agriculture decision, which finally kind of fell through, is that the same deadlines were being given for, PSH, SSM, cotton, and at the same time, export restrictions and market access. So that is problematic. We don't know exactly what's happening. But also another issue is that we know that our countries, and all countries, but it's been harder on developing countries, net food importing developing countries, LDCs, the food crisis, even from the COVID pandemic, and then the food crisis because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. So they have been saying we need policy space. We need to, in a way, increase our production productivity. But they are being told that, no, you just need to give market access, don't have export restrictions, don't have any trade restriction, just liberalize trade, and that's the solution. So we are seeing really two extremely opposite frameworks and approaches to food security, also agricultural reform, that, for the future, for sustainability, we should bring in agriculture reform. But the reform package that is kind of being hinted at, we don't know whether the progress from Doha round, which is key for developing countries, whether those would be protected. So that is where we are at. But I just wanted to end saying that every time, it's developing countries, particularly India, that gets blamed for crash of the talks. Even, every ministerial that happens. This time we hear there are major tensions between US, EU among the developed countries. And I'm not sure what is the dynamics there, but it really seems like they themselves are actually blocking any outcome on agriculture. For developing countries, getting even, renewed mandates, strong mandates on their issues would be very important. So the agriculture outcome is important for them, but we are really hearing that it's developed countries who are actually not happy, and they are really trying to block. So we will see how it goes, and we will, of course, be watching, as I'm sure you will, with keen interest, what happens in MC13. I hope I didn't take too much time. Thanks, Deborah. I'll end here.
Thank you so much, Ranja. Agriculture is a big thorny issue, lots of different things. So we started in the US. I'm from the US. So we had Lebanon, New Zealand, India, Argentina, the Pacific, India again. And now, last but absolutely not least, we will hear from a very important perspective, Africa Kisa, who is representing the CIATINI, the Southern and Eastern African Trade and Investment Negotiations Institute, and actually here representing the Africa Trade Network. Africa, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Deborah, and greetings to the members of the Fourth Estate. Well, the history of the WTO Ministerial Conferences reflects challenges for most African countries, because it's often influenced by power dynamics, geopolitics, political alliances within the WTO, and these often affect negotiation outcomes. We note that as we run to the MC13, leaders are fixated on achieving outcomes, while African countries are engaged in discussions regarding the balance between quantity and quality outcomes of the MC13. And the challenge here is that African countries risk having their issues sidelined. This situation, we believe, as Africa, raises the critical question of whether we should have no outcome or whether we should set off an outcome that may not respect and meet the desired standards of Africa. This game makes me have three key issues that I wish to present regarding what Africa needs. The first issue is in terms of the necessity to preserve policy space, industrial development, and rebalancing of trade rules in order to promote industrialization in Africa. The current rules, unfortunately, the current positions on all the rules on the agenda are speaking about liberalizing or further liberalization. And yet we believe that policy space is important for Africa. To achieve policy space, therefore, which is critical for industrialization, we believe that the MC13 should provide Africa with the necessary policy space to integrate more meaningfully. The question is meaningful integration. And most importantly, ensure that qualitative broad value chain and suppliers and exporters of primary products is addressed. Otherwise, the current rules lock Africa as a producer and supplier of raw materials without any efforts of industrialization. On TRIPS, we were disappointed as Africa, we still are, that the current note on developing countries request for an extension of the waiver on therapeutics and diagnostics may not be agreed upon at the MC13. We recall that the TRIPS Council report recognizes that there has been considerable efforts by members to support a fact and evidence discussion. But when it comes to the conclusion, the report notes that there is no consensus, that has been reached on the extension. So we believe that the current discussions on TRIPS might not be paramount for Africa's efforts for access to COVID-related, and even not only COVID, but also other pharmaceutical-related therapeutics and needs. On e-commerce moratorium, we also note the potential revenue loss for Africa, which is projected at $2.6 billion US. And given the challenges of COVID-19 and the structural challenges that have been affecting Africa in terms of resources, we believe that the moratorium will negatively impact on Africa's efforts, which are the laggards as far as liberalization is concerned. We also believe that the moratorium could undermine the existing industries, and therefore we believe that issues related to moratorium should be disciplined and should be handled to ensure that Africa's potential loss for revenue is addressed. I want to end with talking about the process that lead to the MC13. We recall that in June 2021, during the MC12, the text on interim fisheries and subsidies, it was chopped, changed, agreed, and this was at the last minute. And again, this was in a closed door, more of green room meetings. We recall as Africa largely that at the closing ceremony, that was around 6 a.m. on the 17th of June, when all the decisions were grappled for adoption within seconds. The majority of the African countries had not seen that text on fisheries. Same goes for the TRIPS text, where members were presented for the first time with the text they had not seen since 2017. Therefore, as we run to the MC13, we believe that as Africa, in terms of the process, considering the resource constraints that Africa groups usually have, and the smaller numbers that make our delegations, the MC13 should avoid overlaps, be open and inclusive and transparent. No green rooms should be entertained, and basically it should uphold the basic principles of a member-driven organization during the MC13. We believe that and call upon the MC13, prioritize structured discussions, avoid parallel sessions, and ensure transparent communication channels. Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Africa. And I'm going to give folks a second. I believe that you have the ability to raise your hand or to post any comments in the chat. And while you get that going, I'll just give a quick conclusion here in terms of some of the things that my colleagues have shared. And you see that the perspectives are reinforced around the world from civil society groups from the global north and south, just about every content, to stop pursuing a distorted WTO reform agenda, to conclude the development agenda and the policy space for promoting industrialization and structural transformation, and the dealing with crisis language that Kinda and Africa talked about is so important for development. We call on WTO members to stop pursuing plurilateral agreements at the expense of addressing real multilateral concerns, whether it's digital, environment, MSMEs, gender, investment facilitation, or domestic regulation. And on that note, to stop actually using this inclusivity language to hijack what are real development concerns from developing countries, and to stop using sustainability language to hide neoliberal policies, and instead look at how trade contributes to climate change and what changes we can do to reduce that damage. As Kisa mentioned, to agree to a real waiver for COVID-19 vaccines and also therapeutics and diagnostics, and also the TRIPS non-violation complaint moratorium, which should be a no-brainer. As Sophia called for, to oppose the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, which is just a big tech tax evasion. And on agriculture, as Ron just said, that members should agree to an uncomplicated permanent solution for public stockholding, agree to the special safeguard mechanism, and oppose the Cairns Group demands for more, quote, free trade in agriculture. On fisheries, as Adam said, we should be allowing developing countries to expand their artisanal fish production for food security and livelihoods, uphold existing UN Convention on the Law of the Seas rights for members. Countries which cause global overfishing should have to reduce their fleets and subsidies and not face restrictions on where they are now. So I also wanted to mention that we will have an opening press conference at MC13 with many members of our delegation. As I mentioned, we have about 50 people coming from about 20 countries. That press conference will be on the opening day from 10:30 to noon in room 3. We will also be holding events on various issues, an opening one sort of on the panoply of issues. We'll have an event on fish, event on agriculture, event on digital trade, an event on the JSIs and the anti-multilateral agenda, and a closing event. And those will mostly be from 12 to 1:30 each day in the CSO Center in room 2 or 3, but could also be in the morning or afternoon. And of course, if you've all been there with us before, you know that we'll be taking actions every day in the convention center to raise our voices as civil society, to shame those governments that are blocking progress towards a positive outcome, and to support those that are advocating for a positive outcome for workers, farmers, and the environment at the WTO's 13th Ministerial Conference in Abu Dhabi this week. I see Brett's hand up. Brett Fortnum from IUST. I'll go ahead and give you the floor, Brett. And please feel free to let us know if you have a question for a specific person or just to the group in general. Thank you. I think it says you have to unmute. From my side. Is there something else from my side? I've allowed Brett to talk. I don't know.
Brett has to unmute himself. Oh, he's done.
Okay, great.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Brett.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you guys very much for holding this press conference and taking my question.
Oh, you went.
In the
Yeah.
run-up, I've been chatting with a lot of people about the e-commerce moratorium. Is MC13 to be renewed, in your opinion?
Sorry, could you say it again? I think you were going in and out, Brett. I didn't hear the whole question.
Sorry. Is MC13 the best chance for the e-commerce moratorium not to be renewed?
Sophia, do you want to take that?
Well, we know that the moratorium gets renewed every ministerial, and this is a chance not to renew it. But of course, it's hard. We don't see much pushback from other countries. There are some countries who are raising concerns, especially they're trying to discuss what it's inside the moratorium, what does include the moratorium, if it's included only the means of delivery, but also what it's inside the data and what products and services are included inside the moratorium. So we know that the discussions are going that way. I personally do not think that they will stop renewing, but I think it's important at least to start discussing what's inside the moratorium, what do we mean by the moratorium, and that countries start putting their concerns there at the negotiating table. So this is a chance not to renew it, but it's also a chance to raise more concerns and to keep the talks, to keep the negotiations going around what it will include for, especially for peripheral countries. And I think this is really important because that we can see on the table what's in the interest of each country and what type of services they want to protect in their digital economies. So I think that's the way to look at it, in the sense that it's a great chance not to renew it, but if it is going to be renewed, at least it's a great chance to deepen the conversations around what exactly means for each country the moratorium and what interests are taking place in the peripheral countries, what digital industrialization they're capable of doing, and therefore what they need to protect.
Thank you. If I could follow up, one thing I've heard as a possibility is that if the moratorium is renewed, it would be part of a deal to build on the reinvigoration of the e-commerce work program that was agreed to at MC12. I was wondering if I could just get your reaction to that. I mean, if would it be a benefit, in your opinion, to continue to build on that multilateral work program, and is that worth another extension of the moratorium?
Well, we know that the moratorium is inside the JSI on e-commerce, and it's not multilateral, it's plurilateral in that sense. The exception on customs duties and electronic transmissions, it's inside the JSI on e-commerce, and therefore it's plurilateral, not multilateral. So in the multilateral e-commerce program that started in 1998, we have seen that more and more countries are starting to raise concerns. And I think that program, the e-commerce program at the multilateral level that started in 1998, it got stuck. And therefore they started the plurilateral to push the negotiations within the countries that are willing to negotiate this type of things. And they're willing to negotiate neoliberal rules within the plurilateral arena. I don't know if this, I don't know if somebody else wants to jump in, but I think that's the difference between the e-commerce moratorium that started multilaterally and now what they're pushing for in the JSI and e-commerce, that is to make the moratorium permanent at the plurilateral, plurilateral.
My question was specific to the work program that was started in 1998. I know that there's a push to kind of reinvigorate that and build on one of the agreements of MC12 to basically make that forum more active. And one thing I heard is that could possibly happen in conjunction with the multilateral extension of the e-commerce moratorium.
Yes, it could. I personally do not recommend to push for the e-commerce program that started in 1998, especially because the Doha round said that we had to solve all the problems that were before on the multilateral system before adding new items to the agenda being negotiated at the WTO at the multilateral level. And the Doha round hasn't been concluded, and the demands of the peripheral countries hasn't been attended, and they haven't negotiated any of the demands of the developing countries, and therefore they should not be adding new items to the agenda, which is e-commerce, for instance. So I personally do not think it's the right way to go to push for the multilateral e-commerce agreement in any way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia. Thanks, Brett, for that question. If I could just add, I agree with Sophia that any negotiations right now that are dominated by big tech, we're going to be doing the wrong thing. We actually need a moratorium to give all countries policy space to figure out what kind of regulations we need. If we're looking at labor regulations, anti-monopoly regulations, if we're looking at privacy, if we're looking at digital industrialization for development, these are a whole panoply of issues. We have a situation in which Europe, for example, has been doing agriculture for 6,000 years and still says it needs special protections for its farmers. And yet it's asking countries that don't even have a 50% electrification rate to suddenly have a binding set of rules invented by big tech that are obviously meant in their favor. So I think that would be very problematic. But many of the proposals of developing countries in those multilateral conversations have to do with the issues that they put forward regarding the digital divide, as well as addressing issues of the definition of the scope and coverage. Right now, some countries are claiming that the moratorium includes services. Obviously, that's not, something that's established. So I think it is, I agree with Sophia, it's very problematic. And I'm going to put a link in the chat to a letter from a whole group of Latin Americans who are saying, look, now that the US is saying, oh gosh, we put forward these proposals years ago, but we actually need some policy space to figure out our regulation, maybe we should too. So thank you. Are there other questions from the other journalists on here? You can put it, let me see if anything in the Q&A or raise your hand. Be happy to have any other questions. Okay. I don't think we see any more. Brett, is your legacy hand or is that another question? Great. All right. Well, not seeing any more questions, I commend you all to some of the new analysis that you might find on our website at ourworldisnotforsale.net. And also to join us for that opening press conference at 10:30 on the 26th in room 3, as well as to be have the lookout for other announcements about events. And we will also be circulating a directory of the civil society organizations who will be present. And we certainly invite you all to interview them because we can actually comment on the substance of what's being negotiated and how it would affect grassroots communities. What is the actual impact of some of these harmful policies, not just the horse race, but actually the impact of what's going to be talked about next week. So I thank you all for joining us here today, and we will be sending out a recording of this soon. And if there's no more questions, I want to thank the panelists for joining us from around the world for such an enlightening press conference, and the journalists for being on, and anyone else who is joining us. Thank you very much for your participation today, and we will see you next week in Abu Dhabi. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you.